With regard to the question of common sense and freedom, there is a very rich tradition which takes as its starting point the idea that people have natural rights and that any institutional structure that infringes upon those rights is illegitimate. And if it can be justified, it's only a sort of a temporary, contingent justification under particular circumstances. And one has to be questioning about such justifications. Now, these intrinsic rights are held to be natural rights, that is, part of human nature. And human nature is part of the natural world. If it's part of the natural world, we ought to be able to learn about it by rational inquiry. And to some extent we can. There is, but social theory, and even more important, social practice, cannot be held in abeyance while science makes its halting steps towards discovering the truth about human nature, and philosophy makes its perhaps still more halting steps towards exploring and clarifying the connection which we all sense exists between rights and the nature in which they're rooted, a tricky and complicated question. So we have to make an intuitive leap as human beings, as moral agents. We have to make an intuitive leap and establish a posit and take a certain view and conception as to what human nature is and what rights grow out of it and what structure of institutions and interpersonal arrangements is legitimate with relation to what I take to be intrinsic human needs and intrinsic human rights that grow from them. Now, any moral reasoning, any decision with regard to a choice of action that's taken by a person of integrity, a person who regards himself or herself as a moral agent, that is, who considers their actions to be judged by criteria of right or wrong, any such reasoning is based implicitly, at least, on some conception of this sort. A moral act is undertaken, an act in the moral realm is undertaken, at least in part, and maybe wholly, in terms of some consideration of the likely human consequences and whether those human consequences will accord with human needs and human rights. Now, some say, religious pacifists might argue that that's not all that's required, that the use of violence is wrong, even if it happens to satisfy and defend fundamental human needs and rights. One can question whether that's a moral stance or an immoral stance, but without going into those non-trivial issues, still it's true that a large part, and maybe all, of moral judgment is based on an assessment of the consequences and an evaluation of those consequences with regard to intrinsic human rights and intrinsic human needs, and such an assessment can only be made on the basis of at least an implicit conception, an implicit theory, if you like, of what human nature is. And a moral agent will undertake such reasoning. A person who takes himself or herself seriously as a person of integrity will undertake such reasoning to the extent that you can, and will also try to clarify the principles and the grounding of the judgments as much as one can. That's what it means to be a moral human being, whether you're dealing with your children or foreign affairs or whatever it is. Now, there are a number of views about these topics that have been developed over the years, but they are really intuitive judgments. They go well beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. One conception is that a fundamental human need, and hence a fundamental human right, is the right and the need to inquire and to create free of external compulsion. That's, in fact, a leading doctrine of classical liberalism in its original 18th century version, not the version that reaches us through, say, Margaret Thatcher or something like that, but in its original version. In fact, I was quoting from Wilhelm von Humboldt, who directly inspired John Stuart Mill. from this conception of human nature, that its fundamental basis is a need to inquire and create free from any external compulsion, you derive certain consequences. The consequence that Humboldt and his followers, the classical liberal followers, derived was that whatever does not spring from free choice, but only from instruction and guidance, is alien to our nature. If a worker labors under compulsion or a student produces on demand, as Humboldt put it, we direction, guidance, and force, any kind of force, otherwise not. Now that's a certain picture of, from that you can continue to spell out a conception of what the world ought to be like. Well, I think that's a rather attractive view, at least for people of any faith in human worth and dignity, and it does ground a certain social theory and certain choices of course of action. Now, counterposed to that, there's a very different view, a view which in fact has been dominant in modern intellectual discourse about these topics for the last several centuries, and that's the doctrine that is sometimes called the empty organism theory, that people have no intrinsic nature, that human nature is just a historical and cultural product, and that the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes whatever it wants, and that people become whatever instruction and guidance makes them. That's a view which is familiar from modern, though not classical, liberalism. It's explicit in Marxist theory, where it takes a particular form, and in fact it's the dominant conception of modern intellectual discourse on these matters. And that view also has its consequences. One consequence is that there is no moral barrier whatsoever to compulsion, since there's no intrinsic human nature, and the human essence is just whatever experience and culture and history make it. There's no barrier in the way of compulsion or shaping of behavior or manufacture of consent. There's nothing that stands in the way of those who claim the right to coerce and control. And notice that that's also an attractive view, namely from the point of view of those who undertake that task and consider that their task, the task of control and coercion. And my own feeling is that the reason for the prevalence of this doctrine from what's called left to right is because it is so attractive. It's so attractive to the commissars, to the intellectuals, the people who want the right to control and therefore want to eliminate the moral barriers to control. Well, from that conception follows a different notion of what are legitimate social institutions and legitimate courses of social action. Well, apart from hopes and preferences, what can we learn about truth and falsehood? If we want to discover which of these, or maybe some other view, is correct, we have to proceed by the methods of inquiry that we undertake when we try to learn whether anything else is true or correct. Again, whether it's in personal life or in scientific research, not all that different. Now here, we have to begin by refining and clarifying these notions and then subjecting them to direct inquiry, experiment if possible, and so on. Now that's actually been done in some areas, limited areas, and it has some success and there are some interesting results. One of the areas in which it's been done is one of those that's mentioned in the introductory, in the pamphlet or whatever it was, the notification for this conference, where there was discussion of the notion of innate knowledge, what Hume described as that part of our knowledge that comes to us from the original hand of nature, what in modern terms would be called that part of our knowledge that derives from genetic endowment. Now here, there's a lot of work, and its general conclusion is that Hume vastly understated and underestimated that part of our knowledge that comes to us from the original hand of nature, and that a much more accurate perception was given by his predecessors. For example, the English Platonists of the 17th century, or Lord Herbert, or the continental rationalists, who assumed, and it turns out, as far as we know rightly, that there's a very rich structure of innate concepts and principles that lead to the growth of modes of perception and understanding and interpretation and judgment and evaluation and inquiry and creation and so on, and that this is what leads to the possibility, to the human ability to attain rich and highly articulated and complex systems of understanding and thought, largely shared with others and serving as the basis for everything from social interaction to personal discovery and creation. Now, in any area where we know anything, this seems to be the conclusion. One can still maintain the empty organism theory for areas where we don't know anything. You can say, well, maybe where we don't know anything, it's true, but that's not a very convincing position. But I think that's, roughly speaking, a fair conclusion from present understanding. From this point of view, it looks as though teaching is an irrelevance largely, and even learning is sort of an artifact which happens only at the margins, and personal development and growth of the mind is like growth of the body, or to be more precise, like growth of other parts of the body, since mental organs are just one species of physical organs. That shouldn't be a terribly surprising result. It shouldn't be too surprising to discover that human beings above the neck are very much like human beings below the neck, and in fact like everything else in nature. But that would be the conclusion that we know that that's true of everything else in nature, of every other complex organism. And as far as we know, it's also true of the mind, contrary to received doctrine of the sort that's dominated intellectual discourse. Now, again, I want to stress that these are only small areas. Most of the topics that interest and concern us, essentially nothing's known. Any layperson knows as much as the scientist who's dedicated a lifetime of inquiry to these topics, but there's some small areas where a lot is known, and this seems to me a kind of a fair resume of the kind of thing that's known. Well, where does that leave us with regard to social action and practice? Answer, very far away. There still remains an enormous gap between what we have to grasp in order to ground moral action, to choose a course of action on moral grounds, enormous gap between that and what we in fact understand about human nature and the human needs that derive from it and the human rights that derive from it. Big gap. So we're left where we were with the need to make an intuitive leap and to posit some judgment about what real intrinsic human nature is, to try to evaluate and ground it as best we can, always take a critical attitude toward your assumptions and apply them where they can, but recognizing that there's in a sense, you're staking your faith in what you think or hope human beings may be. Now, if you take as your faith that of, say, the classical liberal doctrine, you will conclude that there is no justification, there's no moral justification for the commissar or the central committee or the cultural or corporate manager or any of the others who control and coerce us on specious grounds. Notice that from this point of view, what is regarded as the progressive position, the one that's reflected in, say, modern liberalism or Marxist thought and so on, is actually deeply conservative and reactionary. It serves to legitimate existing institutions or other institutions of authority and compulsion. In contrast, the actual classical liberal view, which is very different from what is known, with its deep innatist roots, is very subversive and radical because it challenges the existence of any form of authority and requires that it be justified, which can rarely be done. It's not too surprising, I think, that the actual ideas of the Enlightenment have been subjected to such broad-ranging attack. They are radical and subversive, because of the faith that they express in human capacity and human rights and human needs and their richness. And that's a deeply upsetting view from the point of view of any institutional structure which is concerned with control and manipulation, or any of the people who operate within those institutional structures. And of course, those who do attain a position of being articulate, where they can reach the public, well, they're the ones who, in fact, satisfy the needs of the institutions. They're the ones who are called intellectuals, so it's not too surprising that these are the dominant views, the dominant articulated views. There is constant resistance to them on the part of the general public, and I think that's quite healthy and realistic. It's a resistance to infringement on fundamental human rights. Well, if one takes this position, the next thing to do is to make the intuitive leap and turn to the concrete, substantive questions of acting as a moral agent, choosing a course of action. And here what you do is seek out structures of authority and domination. Often we don't see them, so you have to try to find them, even though they're there. Once you notice them, you see them. Seek them out, ask the question as to whether they in fact are legitimate for some contingent reason, say self-defense or whatever argument is put forth. And if they fail that test, as they almost invariably do, to move forward to dismantle them, which means solidarity and organization and so on. That's a hard task. You can look back at history and gain a certain degree of encouragement from it, but you'll also learn from history that a lot of suffering that goes on in acting like a moral agent, suffering and satisfaction, both. But there are achievements. There are real achievements. It's not, for most of human history, for example, literal human slavery was considered legitimate, in fact considered quite praiseworthy. It was for the benefit of these depraved creatures who shouldn't be left on their own. It's only a little tiny period of human history where this is considered a total obscenity. And the fact that it is considered a total obscenity is an achievement. In the 18th century, it was pointed out that wage slavery is fundamentally not very different from slavery. If people are compelled to rent themselves in order to survive, it's not very different than selling yourself in order to survive. That's an insight that has yet to be recovered, but it's a valid one. And in fact, notice that it grows from these same conceptions of human nature. But at least literal human slavery would no longer be justified by, I suppose, almost anyone, maybe Roger Scruton or someone, but almost no one. That's an achievement. It's a moral achievement. It's a moral advance. Just in our own lifetimes, the questions of the legitimacy of sexist oppression have come to the fore. It's not that they were never noticed before, but there's been a sustained and committed effort to bring them to consciousness. And it's not long ago, anybody my age will know that it's not long ago, they just didn't see it. You didn't notice it. It's just part of the background. Now at least you see it. The problems are there, but it's a moral advance that the problems are recognized to be there. There's some effort to come to terms with them. The same is true in every other domain. Take, say, freedom of speech, which is in many ways the fundamental human freedom. If you don't have freedom of speech, you don't have anything else. The battle for freedom of speech has been a long and bitter one, and it's very far from won. In this respect, the United States is maybe the most advanced country. At least there's a structural guarantees for freedom of speech of a sort that don't exist anywhere else, as far as I know. But that's very recent, and it's worth bearing in mind that it's very recent. Theoretically, freedom of speech is established by the First Amendment to the Constitution, but that's pure theory, never meant a thing. The freedom of speech barely existed throughout most of American history long after the Bill of Rights. In fact, that was understood at the time. James Madison, one of the major authors, pointed out that what he called a parchment barrier will never stand in the way of tyranny. Rights are not gained by writing down words on paper, but by constant struggle. to achieve them and to discover what they are and to secure them and to defend them. And there has been a long struggle in the United States. The labor movement and the anti-war movement and civil rights movement and other popular movements finally expanded the domains of freedom of speech to the point where they reached, in fact, by 1969, in the Supreme Court, they finally reached the libertarian standard that had been declared by people like, say, Jeremy Bentham in 1776. And I think the United States is alone in this respect. Now, that's typical. All of human history is a history of everything that's decent in human society that I can think of derives from unremitting and constant popular struggle to identify human nature and its characteristics, to determine the rights that follow from it, and to fight for those rights. That's not an easy task. If there's another way to achieve it than constant struggle, it has yet to be made public.